So we're going to go now to my great interview with Mr. Thomas Durkin. All right, so my guest today is Mr. Thomas Durkin. Mr. Durkin is a legendary national criminal defense attorney based in Chicago. He's endlessly battled to uphold due process in extremely tough legal circumstances, representing numerous Guantanamo detainees and suspected terrorists, and litigated against the Trump administration's Muslim ban. And he currently serves as the Distinguished Practitioner in Residence and co-director of the National Security and Civil Rights Program at the Loyola Chicago Law School. Mr. Durkin, thank you so much for being my very first guest.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
We'll jump right into it here. Amy Coney Barrett, Trump's pick to replace RBG. Her nomination looks pretty likely, and she has a pretty extensive record of anti-worker, pro-corporate decisions, and of course her religious tilt on her decisions. I just want to get your take on the stakes at play here for her nomination and what a 6-3 conservative majority looks like in the Supreme Court for the decades to come.
Well, until the gathering in the Rose Garden and the spreading of the pandemic amongst all the people that were there without masks, including Father Jenkins from Notre Dame, where she's on the faculty and is a graduate of the law school, which is my alma mater as well, an undergraduate. I'm not as sure today, whatever day it is, things change every day, but on Saturday, October 3rd, I think her nomination is not as sure as it was Thursday. If for no other reason, I'm told there was another Republican senator that tested positive after being at that ceremony. I think there's 3 or 4 people. And I think they have to vote from the floor. I don't think they can vote remotely.
They're currently down to 49-49. So if they lose another senator, they'll lose that tie break with Pence.
That's what I think. So, I'm not sure it's a done deal, but I think it might be a done deal after the election. They may try to jam it through, in the lame duck period, assuming Biden wins. But, she is a kind of a classic member of the Federalist Society, which is the organization which has packed the court, so to speak, with people of the mindset of Anton Scalia over the originalism or strict constructionist constitutional theory, which I don't find convincing. But the Federalist Society has become extremely powerful, and particularly powerful in Republican circles. I think Trump has appointed 300 judges so far. Probably the most consequential appointments are in the circuit courts of appeals, where Barrett sits today. I don't have the number handy, but there's a considerable number of Circuit Court of Appeals judges that have been appointed. Most of them are Federalist Society adherents, and those are really the highest courts in the land, but for the Supreme Court. And for example, in Chicago, we're in the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. And that's the court that establishes federal constitutional legal principles for that circuit. It's incredibly powerful. It is extremely conservative. It's always been conservative. I've been practicing in Chicago for 47 years, and it's always had a reputation as being somewhat of a conservative court, but it's never been as conservative as it is now. And that same principle will certainly apply to the Supreme Court if she gets on it. 6-3 is pretty difficult, particularly in these times when things have become so politically oriented. Not that politics has ever been absent from the Supreme Court, but it's a touchy subject now. So it will definitely change things. It'll make the liberal constitutional theory or philosophy that I grew up with from the Warren Court. I graduated from law school in 1973, and I frequently tell my students that you cannot recognize the constitutional law I grew up with because it was in the heart of the Warren Court, and it was a very liberal-oriented, just the opposite of the originalist or the strict constructionist, that the Constitution was a growing body. It changed over time. And that's how they changed Plessy versus Ferguson. That's how they became, Brown versus the Board of Education. There was a whole Miranda came in at that point. Terry versus Ohio on stop and frisk. All kinds of procedural constitutional protections that became built into the criminal justice system and how it operated, which has been whittled away in the 47 years I've been at it greatly, such to the extent that we still have 40-some people in Guantanamo who've been held since. I have a client who's been held in Guantanamo now since 2002. He was on the first couple of plane loads, and he's never been charged. And he's been ordered released by the periodic review board that President Obama put in, but he didn't get the paperwork done between the time Obama was leaving office. There's a 30-day requirement for the Department of Defense to certify that it's okay to release him. And since there were not 30 days left in the administration, Obama left it to the Trump Secretary of Defense to make that decision. And it's really kind of a pro forma decision because the periodic review board's decision generally controls. And Trump has never instituted the position or filled a position at the Department of Defense where that decision could be made. So he's effectively just suspended that client. We're filing a pleading challenging that detention now under the suspension clause of the Constitution. But it's those kinds of major changes that it would have been incomprehensible when I graduated from law school. But today it's de rigueur. It's just, as I frequently say when I lecture, we've become a much angrier country, much more mean-spirited. Everything operates on fear these days.
To your point about Guantanamo, Trump spent a lot of his time on the campaign trail talking about how he wanted to even use Guantanamo for domestic prisoners and stuff. You've spent a lot of your career now, especially since 9/11 and the Patriot Act, sort of battling that growing state of exception and the growing kind of creeping authoritarian national security state of sorts. What does what you talked about, where he's packed a lot of these federal courts, what will be the legacy that Trump leaves behind in terms of the coming decades and how that slide towards the national security state will continue?
Well, in fairness to Trump, it has been one consistent policy after another. Obama essentially adopted George W. Bush's national security policies when push came to shove. Yes, he tried to close Guantanamo. I think it was a glaring mistake of his presidency to not do it right away. He thought that, I guess he thought he was going to be able to get bipartisan support and be the peacemaker, but that's not possible these days. But he, in my opinion, he should have sent planes down there and brought them back to the U.S. If they were on United States soil, all bets would have been off, because then there's no question that the due process clause applies. But very recently, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals issued an opinion saying clearly that due process simply doesn't apply to the Guantanamo detainees, which is rather frightening. But, you know, in terms of the legacy on the war on terror, the growing national security state, I think the most important consideration to be your audience ought to be aware of is the growing demand for a domestic terrorism statute. There is no federal domestic terrorism statute right now. There is a federal definition of domestic terrorism, which is used in the criminal code, which is used for sentencing purposes, but it's not, there isn't a statute that criminalizes domestic terrorism. And the FBI has been pushing for a number of years to get a federal domestic terrorism statute. And Trump frequently refers to domestic terrorism, except when it's the Proud Boys and the white supremacists that he wants to curry favor with. But to me, that's the most frightening and potentially dangerous development that's on the horizon. And I think that it will ultimately get past, Trump or no Trump, but particularly with Trump. If Trump stays in office, then all bets are off in terms of the national security state domestically. He seems to have no regard for constitutional principles, and somebody in his mindset of, you know, nationalistic, fear-driven ideology is going to use those tools as best he can. He showed that in Portland when he sent the federal people in. He seems to be quite happy having these crazy fools running around as self-declared militias, which is totally illegal. But this domestic terrorism statute is very, very dangerous, because what it will do is give the FBI the authority to investigate groups. And once they start investigating groups, they'll have to do what they've done foreign, is they will then have to convince Congress that they need to be able to label certain domestic groups as terrorist organizations. And that's how we pretty much prosecute all terrorism now. So it's material support for terrorism under sections 2318 USC 2339A and B. And those are the tools that they use to prosecute the people going overseas to join ISIS, who send money to Hamas, who send money to ISIS. Those are all prosecuted as material support to terrorism cases. And once they begin to do that domestically, it's going to become very dangerous from a civil liberties standpoint. Because once they can, they can say that the Bellarmine Catholic Social Democrats are a threat to the world and order, and they get designated, all bets are off. Nobody could then give you a nickel. You can essentially do nothing. And that will lead to all kinds of other abuses, because they will then, in order to investigate domestic terrorism, they're going to need a domestic equivalent of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, which is that secret court in Washington that authorizes eavesdropping and foreign intelligence surveillance in a secret court. And it's my opinion, and those who kind of follow and defend these cases, it's mostly everybody's conclusion that once they get the domestic terrorism statute, they will then need a domestic eavesdropping statute of some sort. And then that's going to require a secret court. And you'll start the whole...
Sort of bringing that whole NSA apparatus of surveillance right on home. And
exactly.
Especially, you mentioned some of like Portland and stuff. Really the big three moments that come to mind in terms of that Trump legacy he'll leave behind is, of course, Portland and sending in the National Guard there, and the people were just dragging people away in unmarked vans. Of course, Washington, D.C., when he marched out with the Bible and just sort of sent the army in. And then, him sort of combining with, we've seen Portland police do it. But of course, at the debate, there is kind of this effort to kind of deputize those right-wing militias into sort of their own police force. But more than anything, there's just sort of this disregard for those basic principles. And when he wanted to classify Antifa as a terrorist group, of course, the FBI came back and said, well, they're not a group. And as Biden said at the debate correctly, like, it's an idea, not an organization. But it feels very easy if they were able to pull that off and say, oh, Antifa's terrorism. Well, now you can label anyone as Antifa. Are you against fascism? Okay, you're Antifa. And it feels very easy to kind of go down a slippery slope of, once you're labeled, as you said, no money can go your way, and some of your constitutional rights are waived, right?
There's no question about it. And I mean, for that matter, terrorism is an idea too. That's why I think it was foolish to declare a war against terror. We haven't done well with wars. I wrote an article once in a law review about, I called it something to the effect of a permanent state of exception brought to us courtesy of the wars on crime, drugs, and terror. And the criminal justice system, in my opinion, is not designed to fight wars. The criminal justice system is a procedural application of how we treat the violation of laws, and it's usually a retrospective decision. You prosecute people who have committed crimes, and the wars on crime, drugs, and terror are all prospective. Now, yes, you can have a war on drugs and you can set somebody up for having sold kilos of cocaine, but what started in the war on drugs was a great informational system that the DEA devised, and it was you gathered information on someone. If you were stopped in a car in which somebody found 3 joints of marijuana and there were 4 people in that car, and the DEA wrote a report of that stop, they would list the person who if they prosecuted, they would list the person they thought possessed the drug. And then they would list 3 other people at the bottom of the report into a system called NADIS. And I can't remember what it meant, but it was some type of informational distribution system. And the name Seamus McGinnis would be forever in that computer system, so that if they stopped a car 2 weeks later that had 5 kilograms and Seamus McGinnis happened to be in it, that'd be helpful. And that's kind of how that's the way the war on terror is developed as well. It's information gathering. And that's the classic product of surveillance. And you have the state surveilling its own citizens. Our mutual friend Bernard Harcourt has written a tremendous book on that called The Counter-Revolution. I think the subtitle is How the Government Went to War Against Its Own People, which I think is very poignant and astute. It's true. It's what's happened. It's as if we had a revolution, which we didn't have, and then we have a counter-revolution that for the revolution that didn't take place. And this whole, the national security state has been out of control for a long, long time. And people are now just coming to grips with it, which is another reason that just 4 more years of a Trump presidency would be a complete disaster for civil rights. Not that Joe Biden is a great constitutional civil rights advocate, but I think Biden is certainly wise, and I think he would select decent judges, and I don't think he's a fearmonger. I think he's much more capable of exercising judgment that this presidency doesn't seem to be able to do.
Absolutely. And to your point about Dr. Harcourt, I would recommend that everybody check out The Counter-Revolution. I will put a link to that. And he wrote a wonderful article, I forget for who, but about how, the book is written in 2018, but it ended up being really prescient for this year with the protests, because like you said, there was really no revolution, but they launched a counter-revolution against just sort of an entityless enemy. But then they found their revolution this year with the protests, and so they had the drones going over Minneapolis and stuff. But just one last question for you in terms of the election. Trump and the GOP have very much telegraphed that their plans are tending towards, they want the Supreme Court to decide the election, sort of a Bush-Gore redo. If they're able to pull it off, what do you see as the ability of, litigators in the courts working against or with the judges that probably he's appointed, which plays to his advantage in this case? But what legal routes and then what maybe civil insurrection or civil protest routes are able to be taken in order to combat an election fraud case that they might try to make?
Well, I'm pretty cynical, but I'm not cynical enough yet to believe that just because Trump appointed somebody that they would vote him in as a favor for the appointment. I don't see that happening, although I've been fooled before. I have a lot less faith in our judicial system than I did when I started my idealistic Don Quixote-like approach to the system when I came out of law school. But it also included being a federal prosecutor, I might add, but which sometimes they don't like to admit that I was one. But I find it incomprehensible, and I hope I'm right on this, that just because Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and if Barrett gets there, were appointed by Trump, that they would therefore have to deliver that opinion for him. I haven't reached that point of cynicism yet. Could it happen? Yeah, I think so. But I'm also, I don't know enough about election law. I know, I guess it would presume it would have to come down to one state, because at least Gore versus Bush, as I recall, was all simply over the vote in Florida. I get the impression he wants to throw the votes, the controversy up in like all the battleground states. I don't know how that would work out. I mean, in many ways, those are more state court actions, which would be less influenced by politics. But I can't, I'm a lot more fearful that he will attempt to cause, I think he's telegraphing that he wants civil unrest. I'm much more fearful that he will, and now that he's sick, assuming he recovers, he may have to declare some type of state of emergency, which is one of my pet topics. But I'm fearful that he's going to try to cause civil unrest so that he can declare a state of emergency and then declare the election off. I think that's a bigger fear. I'm more fearful of that than I am whether Gorsuch is going to tip the scale. I think I have a lot of respect for John Roberts. I knew people that worked with him when he was a lawyer and who thought very highly of him. He grew up in the town I'm in today. We have a place in Long Beach, Indiana, and he grew up here. And people speak highly of him here that remember him. I have a lot of respect for Roberts. I think he's the real deal. And I think he also understands his place in history, and it's his court. And I have a lot of faith that Roberts won't let his court become a political tool for that purpose. I think he might be happy philosophically letting it shift more to the right, but I'm not. Maybe I'm just naive, but I'm less concerned about that Bush versus Gore scenario than I am whether or not he can convince. My understanding is the idea of suspending the election is all up to the various states, but the Republicans, I believe, control more states than the Democrats. So it's a very dicey issue, and I think that this nod to the right-wing extremists ought to be the most frightening thing that everybody pays attention to, because the debate, I thought, was hardly even dog whistling. I think it was outright incitement, and coming from the President of the United States is pretty astonishing. But
pretty unprecedented, even just generally speaking, but especially for modern America, for something like that to happen on the national stage. So,
well,
thank you.
But
go ahead.
We've never experienced anyone like him, and in some ways, this not novel thought. He's a symptom more than but that just because he's a symptom doesn't mean that he isn't extremely dangerous. He's a very, very dangerous man. And these are very, very dangerous times if anybody cares about civil liberties and the preservation of our Republican form of government. For your listeners, I'd recommend, there's an excellent article by Noam Chomsky a week or two ago that talks about how easily it would be, how things are unraveling, and how thin the line is between anarchy and rule of law. And he refers to the Federalist number 10, written by James Madison. And I recommend that to all your listeners because it's frightening. It's the Federalist tract that talks of factions. If you may remember reading that in the civics class or something, but it talks about factions, and it talks about how delicate the balance is in a Republican form of government, which we have. Everybody says, "Oh, it's all democracy." They were very afraid of straight democracy, and I recommend Federalist number 10 to all your listeners because it's very prescient and warns about exactly the state that we're in.
Absolutely, especially with warning against the power of political parties, that when they have as much power as they do now, that will be the end of the republic as we know it. So,
yeah.
Mr. Durkin, thank you so much for taking the time to be my very first guest here.
My pleasure.
Well, on that very positive note, we will conclude our very first episode of Social Point. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. It means the world to me. Thank you again to Mr. Thomas Durkin for doing the interview. And if you get a chance, please subscribe on YouTube and follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get the podcast format. It really means the world. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys on Thursday. Take care of yourselves. You've been watching Social Point. If you enjoyed this video, please take a second to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. Follow us on Spotify and iTunes if you enjoy the podcast format, and follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Social Point Pod. Thanks for watching.